Before the internet, hiding one's identity was in many ways much easier than an electronic paper trail now permits. Jack Marx was one man who took advantage of this fact, creating the anomaly that was his conflicting identities and muddied backstory. He became Jamake Highwater to those he encountered, engaging the public on Native American topics that, although popular, were derided by some advocates as grossly inaccurate. Unraveling who Jamake Highwater really was begins with picking out exactly when Jack Marx was born. A birth certificate for one Jack Marx lists February 14, 1931 as his date of birth, though throughout his life he would give various later dates. It states he was born in Los Angeles to Martha Tourette's and Alexander Marx. Details about his upbringing are conflicting, especially when Jack Marx himself spoke of them. One story suggests he had several role models who nurtured an interest in writing, including a woman by the name of Alta Harris Black. Black was a teacher who gave Jackie access to a massive literary collection and was friends with a Papago man named Marcelin Mamake. A senior named Jack Marx graduated from the class of 1950 at North Hollywood High School. According to an alumni newsletter from 2005, he was already demonstrating a theatrical taste doing school stage production while attending. 1 year later, Jack was befriended by Ines Nin, a French-Cuban-American author who encouraged him to pursue writing. He nonetheless decided to teach dance when he moved to San Francisco 2 years after that. In 1954, the elder Alexander Marx died. Requests were made by the Marx family for the military insignia Star of David to be put on his gravestone, reflecting a Jewish heritage. Jack Marx later dodged this fact by suggesting he was adopted, or that his mother had Cherokee blood. Mr. Marx formed the Contemporary Dancers Guild around 1955. He had given a number of lectures on topics ranging from Western ideology to sciences around this time. Mr. Marx attempted to secure a reputation for his guild as an institution of sorts, labeling it what he called a world university. It was registered as a non-profit, and Mr. Marx himself is said to have filed for tax exemption around the same time. Later that year, California Senator Claire Engel tried to persuade the U.S. Postal Service to stop him from mailing out non-accredited college diplomas, obtained by following his lectures. Jack Marx adopted the name J. Marx when he began writing for dance magazines, including periodicals in the Bay Area for the next 2 years. Presumably having poor luck, Mr. Marx abandoned his troupe when he decided to move to New York in 1967. 1 year later, his first novel, Rock and Other Four-Letter Words, was released. Mr. Marx tackled the subject of rock and roll in further publications. He began building a career as a rock journalist and author on travel. Amongst other musicians, he managed to interview the elusive Brian Wilson of the Beach Boys, shortly after the infamous concept album Smile was in production.
I was surprised to find out from other guys, other members of the Beach Boys, that you felt like Smiley was easy, that as I understand it, it was going to be sort of a big production thing, and then about midway through you decided, no, why should, because the album production thing is in, why do one, and you pull back, and it made it simpler, but I think it's one of the most complicated albums in the pop field, like things like the wind chime thing, is that what it's called?
Yeah, wind chimes.
Yeah, well that's...
We pulled out of that production pace merely because I was about ready to die.
Right.
On November 20th, 1969, the 2-year-long occupation of Alcatraz Island begins by an organization calling itself Indians of All Tribes. This is supposedly where Mr. Marx's fascination with Native American culture manifests. Around this time, the issue of falsifying Native American heritage was becoming even more prevalent, usually to exploit newly created affirmative action programs. One notable example was the Keep America Beautiful commercial from 1971, in which a crying Native American man was used to promote litter prevention. The actor, a man by the name of Espera Oscar de Corti, was better known by this fake Native American persona, Iron Eyes Cody. A July 13, 1969 interview for the Sunday News is the first time Mr. Marx makes claim to Cherokee ancestry through his birth mother. His writing career was moving along smoothly. His publisher, Columbia Records, also put out a biography on the author which cemented his claim to being born of a Cherokee woman named Marcia Highwater. The story was that his mother was just 15 when she became involved with a 16-year-old Greek boy named Alexandre Markopoulos, which began an association with Greek filmmaker Gregory John Markopoulos that would last both of the men's lifetimes. The author of 1973's Mick Jagger, the singer, not the song, is credited as J. Marx, explained as the pen name for one Jamake Highwater. The transition to this name was not instantaneous. Mr. Marx was still going by J. Marx when he published a book with noted travel author Eugene Fodor titled The Young Person's Travel Guide 1974. The timeline surrounding his birth, a supposed adoption by Europeans, and other important milestones began to shift around this point. Supposedly, Mr. Marx had obtained an affidavit which proved he was adopted by European Americans but born as a Cherokee Indian. Working with Fodor was lucrative, as by this point Mr. Marx helped author Fodor's Indian America under the name Jamake Highwater. In the book's preface, he makes the claim that his father died of a drug overdose, something already known to be untrue. Interviews he gave throughout the next few years continued to add or change details, such as an upbringing in Alberta and that his father died in a car crash. Mr. Marx entrenched himself amongst whatever Native American scholars he could to boost his profile and credibility. The confusion of facts made it more difficult to untangle the truth about Jamake Highwater, something that would inevitably seep into his writings. In 1978, Mr. Marx's youth novel Anpow, An American Indian Odyssey, won the coveted Newbery-award. Many of his other works would also be honored. Anpow remained in curriculums across the United States for decades after, though it, along with his other works, have been equally derided for inaccuracies by Native American advocacy groups. Some advocates, such as an activist named Hank Adams, began keeping track of the inconsistencies in Mr. Marx's upbringing. Mr. Marx in turn attributed this confusion to the uncertainty surrounding his adoption. In one case, references to a childhood friendship with author Susan Sontag conjured up questions about how old Mr. Marx claimed to be. Sontag later refuted having known a Mr. Highwater, opining that if he was indeed the Mr. Marx she knew in high school, she had, quote, no reason to believe anything he says. In 1978, Mr. Marx had an interview with Barbara Lee Diamonstein where he gave his opinion on several Native American scholarly topics.
To make Indian art more visible and more accessible. How do you propose to do that, and with what success have you met?
Well, I mean, I'm doing it in the only way that I know how, by writing about it, since I'm a writer, and who's Indian, and by talking about it, by lecturing and doing things like what we're doing here today. I guess it's hard for me to appraise the success of it, but my books, you know, have done well, and they've been picked up by what's nicest to me is that they're used by Native American studies programs.
Later that year, Mr. Marx's old neighbor, Alta Black, died at 89. His opponent Hank Adams claimed that Mr. Marx often used her Social Security money, amongst other government pensions, to fund most of his ventures, including his old dance guild. Mr. Adams continued to write scathingly about Mr. Marx, though given the time past, it is difficult to cross-reference some of these claims. Mr. Marx continued a distinguished career through the early 1980s, abetted by how few Native American voices there were in the media who could contest his claims. When it is revealed there are no Highwaters in the tribes he was said to hail from, he went to Canada to participate in Blackfoot ceremonies as a means of acceptance. Around this time, his book The Primal Mind was lauded, and eventually turned into a PBS series hosted by Jamake Highwater and produced by Rick Berman. In 1983, Mr. Marx penned an editorial opening up about apparent discrimination he felt as a Native American. This was too much for Hank Adams to bear, who called Mr. Marx out in a piece of his own the following year. Mr. Adams, along with many other Native American scholars, charged that the works of this Jamake Highwater were filled with inaccuracies and stereotypes, going to great lengths to discredit Mr. Marx. Mr. Adams successfully quashed the deal PBS had with its resident Native American expert. Some $825,000 had already been secured by Mr. Marx under the guise of his heritage. This too was scrutinized as fraudulent. By now, Mr. Marx had a sworn enemy in Hank Adams, who continued denouncing his career and would track down any evidence he could to prove Jamake Highwater didn't exist. Mr. Adams sometimes asserted that he was in fact Gregory Markopoulos, but later recanted that once he met the filmmaker. Though Mr. Marx continued undaunted, others began to take notice of the many contradictions that seemed to follow him. The investigative reporter Jack Anderson published his own expose in the Washington Post. When asked why he faked his identity, Mr. Marx stated it was simply to get published. He no longer called himself Cherokee or Blackfoot, but was still seen by many as an expert on Native American history. In 1985, Mr. Marx left New York to found the Native Land Research Center near Hampton, Connecticut. He described it as, quote, a community of artists, critics, cultural commentators, and scholars dedicated to the celebration of world art. In 1986, Hank Adams continued to pursue Mr. Marx with a summons to court stating he falsified his identity to receive grant funding. This was dismissed on a technicality. Mr. Marx later wrote in his book Shadow Show that, quote, "The greatest mystery of my life is my own identity." He authored works on more broad topics from here, such as sexuality, along with several personal essays. In 1992, Mr. Marx moved back to Los Angeles. It is around this time that Gregory John Markopoulos, the Greek director whose life shared so many idiosyncrasies with Mr. Marx's, died. This put an end to any mystery about whether the two could possibly be the same person. 2 years later, Mr. Marx was offered the role as a native consultant on another Rick Berman production, Star Trek Voyager. He advised the development of Commander Chakotay, a member of a Federation colony which bore a resemblance to any number of Native American tribes. Mr. Marx wrote 7 pages for the characters' backgrounds, but still fell short of defining a tribe for the character. This went unresolved throughout the series. After a quiet few years, Mr. Marx died in his home of a heart attack on June 3, 2001. He had a number of his writings and personal effects archived away at the New York Public Library and obtained a seal on particular documents for at least 50 years. Many obituaries, such as one from the Los Angeles Times, continued to repeat some of the claims Mr. Marx made about his life, to the chagrin of Hank Adams and others who'd found holes in the Jamake Highwater story. Though the mainstream media celebrated his life, Mr. Adams had little good to say. His final thoughts on the matter were, quote, "He's Jack Marx, not Jamake Highwater. There never was a Jamake Highwater." The Jamake Highwater story is interesting as it presents a man who obviously took a shine to writing from an early age. Like so many who crave for notoriety, he invented a personality where he could use authority to speak on a subject the public was unfamiliar with. Perhaps the fact that so many people bought into this watered-down idea of Native American cultures is telling of itself. Jack Marx's body of work left behind may fall into obscurity by the time it is unsealed, or looked back on with the same puzzlement some look back on other things from the past with. Whatever the case, many of the big truths about Jack Marx appear to have died with him.